All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the presentation. My name is Jim Kukrill. I'm the founder of the Author Marketing Institute and authormarketingclub.com. And today we are going to talk about the power of podcasting for authors. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here. We previously did a poll, and we found out that the people who were on this presentation were actually a combination of fiction and nonfiction authors. I think it was 29% fiction, 29% nonfiction, and then the rest were both, which I found to be really super interesting. So this is good news because today this presentation is all about podcasting for an author and how you can use a podcast to drive more leads and sales and build your brand and all of those wonderful things. And it doesn't matter if you're a fiction or a nonfiction author. So we're going to get started here today. If you have any questions, you can always email those to me at jimkukrill@gmail.com. And let's get started. So we already covered the fact that people are fiction or nonfiction, because the truth is it doesn't matter. If you want to start a podcast about your book, it doesn't matter if you're a fiction or a nonfiction author. Okay, now I have experience with the fiction side of this. So I am an author myself. I've written over 10 books. I have one traditionally published book, and the rest are self-published. And I also have podcasts. The podcast I do every week for the last 3+ years is called the Sell More Book Show. I do it with my co-host Brian Cohen. It's a news show about the business of self-publishing. We have done over 200 episodes, and we are not a huge show, but we're not small. We've done over 600,000 listens of the show. So there are some podcasts out there that are doing that, in a week. But, we're doing it over a 3-year span. And it just goes to prove that you don't have to be, the biggest, but, you can get a lot of traffic, even a very tiny, small niche category like self-publishing, which the Sell More Book Show is. I also run the Author Marketing Podcast, which I've been doing for over 3 years here and there. I've done over 60 episodes, and that show has done over 450,000 listens on the show as well. I've been an internet entrepreneur for over 20 years and an author and all of those wonderful things. But you didn't come here to learn about me. You came here to learn about the power of podcasting for authors. So let's just get right into it. So before we do that, here's an example of one of my books. I want to just kind of prove the point here that I'm eating my own dog food here. This is one of my books, my book called Go Direct, which was turned into a podcast recently. And you can actually go to iTunes and subscribe to that book, and you can see each chapter is produced as a podcast, and it's working very well for me to drive people back to my other books and my brand and all the other things that I do. So I am doing this as well, and I think you should be doing it too, because your book is the best piece of content you're ever going to create. Now, when I say this to people, I have to just remind them, your book really is that signature credibility piece, fiction or nonfiction, that thing that you put together that is just going to be the best piece of content you ever created. As authors, media creators, whoever we are, musicians, artists, content marketing is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to subscribe, listen, view, read, interact with our content marketing. And a book is the best piece of content you're ever going to create. And the book builds so much credibility for you. And the question for you is, how are you using that book now? So you can do print books, right? Hopefully you have a print book, and you do ebooks, obviously, and you could do audiobooks. But why are you not taking that signature piece of content that is your main thing that you're ever going to produce, and why aren't you turning it into multiple other pieces of content? And one of those should be a podcast. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how to turn your book and your content into a podcast, because you should be. You need to have your signature content distributed across multiple channels, reaching as many people as humanly possible, because that's the point of content marketing, is to reach new audiences, whether you're fiction or nonfiction. And a podcast will absolutely do that for you. So let's start talking about what a podcast is. There are some people who don't know what a podcast is, so I kind of have to explain that here. A podcast is a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading to a computer or a mobile device. It's typically available as a series, new installments of which can be received by subscribers automatically. So it's an audio file. That's all it is. It's audio files that you create that people subscribe to and download and listen to in their cars, on the way to work, on their computer, wherever they want to listen to it, however they want to listen to it. And the difference between an audiobook and a podcast is an audiobook is usually where people pay to get a book read to them. Okay. And a podcast is a different dynamic. It's people subscribing to content so they could get it all at once and binge listen, or they could subscribe and get a new chapter every single week or a new episode per se every single day or week, or however you want to schedule that. But that's all a podcast is. And the biggest difference is that podcasts are free. You know, podcasts have, I'm going to show you some stats on how big podcasts have grown into, but podcasts are free. And that's what people want. They want free, helpful, problem solving, or entertaining content. You know, people use the internet for two reasons and two reasons only. Number one, to have a problem solved, which is nonfiction. And number two, to be entertained, which is fiction. So when you produce your book as a podcast, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and you provide it for free to all of these wonderful places to reach all of these millions of new listeners and customers, you're creating a really great piece of content. And that's what we're talking about today. A podcast will do that. So why podcasting? Well, 68 million Americans tune in monthly to podcasts. And that's 1 in 4 of every single person in America, which is really mind-blowing when you think about that. 1 in 4 of every single person in the United States is listening to podcasts. And this is just America. This is not the rest of the world, which is big as well. I just put the American stats in here from this one infographic that I found. 65% of people just started listening to podcasts in the last 3 years. And that means that podcast is new, it's exciting, and it's very, very, very effective. It's like the wild, wild west. Didn't you ever want to get in on the beginning of the internet, YouTube videos or anything when it first started? The numbers are mind-blowing of how many people are listening to podcasts, who are just going out and finding new podcasts every single day. And people are really, really passionate about the podcast they subscribe to. So podcasting is big, but this is a really interesting fact. The retention rate of auditory learning is 2 times higher than reading. So if you're a nonfiction author and you produce a print book that people can read or an ebook or whatever, when they listen, their ability to learn what it is that they've listened to is 2 times higher than that of reading. And that's just, I guess, the way the human brain works, which is what makes audiobooks such a great medium for having your books in, of course, but also which is why it makes podcasting a great medium for you to have your books in as well, because people are learning at a higher rate and they're engaging more with your stories and your content on an audio form. And that's what podcasting can do for you. How do people listen? Well, 52% listen while they're driving, and the rest break down because they're listening while they're working out, or they're on the road traveling, or they're commuting, right? I listen to a lot of my podcasts when I'm at airports, or I'm on the treadmill, or I'm out fishing or something like that, in the car as well. This is just a great way to reach people when they're not distracted. You know, when I'm working out, my brain is just kind of free from the day and the life and everything. And that's why I'm able to retain that information and be entertained by podcasts when I do that. And the stats show that that's why most people do it. And that's why the reading, auditory learning is so high. So think about the ability of having people interacting with you and your content while they're in their car, or while they're on a treadmill, when they're not distracted from their workday and the rest of their life. It's very powerful, and that's why podcasts function. Now, this is the big stat. So, according to Apple, over 10 billion podcast episodes were consumed on its devices in 2016. That's 10 billion with a B. That's 2 billion more downloads than 2015 and 3 billion more than 2014. So, if you put the chart together in your head here, you can see that this podcasting world is absolutely exploding. 1 in 4 people are listening to podcasts. Over 10 billion podcast episodes were consumed just on Apple devices. We're not even talking about Android and tablets and PCs and all of that, which is an even bigger market. People love podcasts, and that's why you need to get on board and start creating your own. So, why should you podcast a book? Well, here's the great news. You already have the content. So now you just need to use it to reach millions of new customers. So like I said in the beginning, you've already written the book. Now, why don't you turn it into something else where you can reach more people? And specifically, how do you really get an ROI from putting your book into a podcast? Well, think about it for a second. People discover you. Then they listen to the podcast episode, and then they can do things like subscribe to your mailing list and drive more email subscriptions to your offer or your services or your other books. You can promote and build your brand as a podcast. It's a wonderful medium for being able to build another channel and build your brand as somebody who's reaching out into the new tech areas and things like that. If you're a consultant, think about how you could push for consultations. When I wrote my first book for a traditional publisher, I didn't have a podcast back then, but absolutely every time I would write about a new book, I would put out a podcast where I would call for people to, consult with me in every podcast episode. Think about that. If you have a 35 chapter book and you turn that into 35 episode podcast, you've now got 35 times where you're asking somebody to subscribe to your mailing list or call you or schedule a free consultation with you, or you could be promoting your products or your services or promoting your other books. Just think about that for a second. You're creating multiple points of entry with a new medium based on the content you already created. You don't have to recreate anything. That now is going to drive all of those wonderful things back to you because you're giving it away for free. And people are getting the information, and you're using it as a sales funnel to drive people back to your business, your brand, your offer, your other books, all of those things. And that is the power of why you should have a podcast, to reach all those millions of people that, frankly, you're not reaching right now because those people are out there on their own. So, like I said, how'd you like to get a few thousand new people exposed to your book and brand without spending a dime marketing it? Well, here's what happens when you create a podcast. You create a podcast, then you upload it to the podcast directories. Now, here are just a few of them. There are literally hundreds of them. And of course, iTunes being the biggest one. And you put your podcast out there, and it gets spread across the internet to all of these different podcast directories: Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, all of these different places. Google Play is another big one. Spotify is a huge player in podcasting right now. So you create your files, you put it out there, and all of a sudden it's reaching all of these people all over the world without you really even having to do anything except telling these directories about it. And I'm going to show you some stats to prove that here in a second. But that's basically what's happening with podcasting is you submit to these directories after you create your podcast, and they do all the work for you after that. Now, you can market it on your own and promote it on your own, as you should, but the wild, wild west ability of just getting in front of listeners without having to really do anything is there in podcasting right now because they're being consumed at such a high rate. Excuse me. So how do you podcast a book? Well, here are some examples. So Chris Ducker is one of the world's experts on virtual freedom, which is hiring a virtual assistant and being more productive with your time and building a dream business. And Chris has a new book out called Virtual Freedom. And as you can see, what Chris did to accompany his book at his launch was he created a podcast specifically just for the book. And if you go to iTunes and you look up Virtual Freedom, you're actually going to see that he basically took every chapter of the book and broke it out and built it into a podcast to support the book. Now, this is really smart. He's reaching all of these millions of people that perhaps he wasn't going to reach on Amazon or on his website or wherever else he was, in his little world where everybody has their own little world where they promote their stuff. Podcasting is an entirely different world. And the only way you're going to get noticed by any of them is to produce a podcast. And this is a really smart way to do it. He created a podcast and broke it down into chapters and talked about his book. So check that out. That's a great example of how somebody's using a book to podcast. Now, also, Todd Henry is doing the exact same thing, which is really smart as well. He wrote a book called The Accidental Creative. And as you can see, he is taking each kind of blurb or even chapter from his book and breaking it out into short podcast episodes and uploading it to iTunes, but also promoting it on his website as a podcast episode. And what's great about what he's doing here is if you look at the bottom of the page there, you can see he even has a really great call to action at the bottom, driving people back to his email address. Now, in the podcast, if you listen to it, he'll say the same thing. He'll say at the beginning and the end of the podcast, he'll say, look, if you want to get the first 2 chapters of my book, Herding Tigers, just go to accidentalcreative.com/whatever it is, and you can grab a copy of that. So he is a good example, just like Chris was, of somebody who's taken their signature piece of content and transformed it into more than just an ebook, an audiobook, or a print book. Now he's turned it into a podcast. He's turned it into blog posts. He's turned it into an additional way to reach new potential readers and customers and listeners for his brand, his products, his services, and his books. And this is just another great example. All right, let me show you another one. Sherry Rose wrote a book called The Webinar Way, which is all about producing webinars. And Sherry has created a podcast as well based upon the chapters of her book. And you can see the sample landing page here as well. So this is just another example of how you can go out there and build a podcast around your book. Now you're going to say, well, Jim, what about fiction books? Well, let's look at one. So Casey Lane has a book called Cinderella Dreams of Fire, and it's a fairy tale fantasy book. And basically, this is a straight up fiction book that's been broken into 40 chapters or 40 episodes in podcast world, and is now available on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play and all of these places. So this is an example of a fiction book that is produced out there that has the content just put out into the into the podcast universe and is driving listens and traffic and subscribers back to the author's other books. So here's a little stat just to show you, because we help produce the podcast for Casey Lane here. And this stat right here shows you that just in the month of February, because we just launched this, Casey Lane, with zero promotion, with no mentions on social media, no nothing, just by submitting the podcast to the podcast directories, has gotten 738 total downloads of her episodes in less than a month, because today is February 21st. So think about that for a second. Zero effort, zero work. Just submitting your book into a directory is allowing it to be discovered by millions of new people. I don't know how much success you've had with Facebook or Twitter or things like that, but just posting something on Facebook, you're not going to get that many people to see it. The organic reach is horrible. Posting something on Twitter, if you don't have the followers, it's horrible as well. Podcasting is so new and exciting, and there are so many people trying to get podcast content that they find it as soon as it gets released. So when you put your book into these directories, you're instantly going to be exposed to new audiences, and you're not even going to have to do any marketing work to reach people immediately right off the bat. Now imagine if you actually did some marketing work, you could actually have some more of that. So let's review those models about how to podcast a book. First thing you can do is method 1. You can just read your book chapter by chapter, because right now you're like, Jim, I still don't know what to do. Well, look, you've got a 30 chapter book. You could create 30 episodes of your podcast and just read verbatim your book into a podcast, into an audio form, chapter by chapter. It's very simple. You could easily do that. The other method to do that would be to maybe just have a discussion about each chapter. You could say, look, in this week's podcast, we're going to discuss chapter 2 of my book, blank. And here's why I wrote it this way. And here's some of the excerpts from the book and things like that. You could create a podcast like that. Then you could also do it another method where you could bring in experts. You could say, look, we're going to talk this week about chapter 14 of my book, which is about this. And I have some experts and other authors or whoever that I want to bring in. We're going to discuss my strategy and the things I wrote in my book. And we're going to talk about that in this episode. This is a really great way to create podcast episodes because you're bringing in people from other genres, from other people who are maybe share the same expertise as you do. You're getting back and forth with people on the podcast, and of course they're promoting it to their audience as well after you do it. So this is another great way to do a podcast. Now, the fourth way to do it, and there are more, but these are really the main ones you could really focus on, is just creating new content to support your book. I don't know if you know who Gary Vaynerchuk is, but Gary V, as they call him, has a new book out called Crushing It. And basically, Gary creates this podcast that's super powerful and motivational, inspirational, but he's not talking about really the book chapter by chapter. He just kind of talks about everything related to and around the book. And he drives so many listens and downloads to this podcast that at the end of every podcast, he reminds everybody to go grab a copy of his book, Crushing It. So you have these methods for which you can produce a podcast, and it's not that difficult. Read it chapter by chapter, discuss each chapter, have interviews with experts, or just do a riff content of podcast where you just kind of riff on your thoughts of the day. Don't make this overcomplicated. If you don't think that you can be spontaneous and talk and not have a script, then you could just do the read it chapter by chapter method. If you think that maybe you could do a combination of both, you could read some of your book and then you could just talk about parts of your book with method 2. If you really want to have backup support, you could do the interviews with experts one, where you're just having a conversation with someone. That's a great way to podcast. And then the fourth way is really if you just want to go in and just off the cuff start talking about each chapter in your book and your business and everything, and that can be really effective as well. All right, so podcasting is really great. I've kind of proven that to you hopefully here. So the question is, why doesn't everyone do it? Well, let's talk about it. Well, there are some problems with podcasting, and the one of them is it's kind of expensive. Okay, so the mic that I'm using right now to talk to you on is a Heel mic. It's that one on the left, and I think I bought it 4 years ago for $450. I have the mic stand, I have the pop filter, I have the $100 headphones, I have a $350 mixing board. I have all the podcasting tools, all the little toys, because I do a lot of podcasting, and that's why I'm able to get this really great sound. So podcasting can be very expensive if you want to do it really right. All these things I'm talking about here are the middle of the road costs. You can go lower and you can do podcasting at a lower level. You're going to lose some sound quality, but you can do these things at a higher level too. You could spend 3 times as much money, but podcasting can be very expensive. And that's one of the reasons why people don't start podcasts, but there are more costs involved as well. So you got to create your own podcast artwork. You got to pay an artist to create that artwork for you. You have to host your podcast. Each podcast that you produce has to be hosted someplace so that it can feed into iTunes directories and other directories. So that you have to pay for that, which gives you stats and all those things. And of course, if you want to spend any money marketing your podcast and getting the word out there as extra costs, you can. So, I mean, if you did all of those things we just talked about, you're talking about, over $3,000. And that's just to do, get set up and get started in podcasting. So that stops a lot of people from being successful with podcasts because they can't get past that cost level. Now, at the end of this presentation, if you stick around, I'm going to talk about some cheaper and easier ways to do podcasting. So stick around for that. But the other problem with starting a podcast is it's really complicated. Now, the good news for you, and this is really, really good news, is that you already have the content. You don't have to come up with a show idea. You don't have to write a script. You don't have to do any of that. You already have it done. You have a book. All you have to do is take your book and break it into one of those methods like I talked about earlier in this presentation. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You don't have to create it from scratch. Now, after you set up your equipment, you're going to have to do a lot of things. You're going to have to record your voice. A lot of people don't like to learn or don't like to listen to their own voice or have their voice recorded. They don't want to do it. You have to learn how to use the editing and recording software to produce your podcast. You have to get the software and learn how to edit the podcast and add in your music and do all of those things. Then you have to create your own podcast artwork, and you have to find hosting and submit it to all the directories. And that kind of goes to my second page, which is there's more to do. That's why it's so complicated. You're going to have to create and validate your podcast feed, which is that thing you get from your hosting provider that submits to directories. Tag your audio file with metadata so that it gets categorized in the right places through the directories. You're going to have to figure out how to submit your podcast to all those directories one by one, or use a hosting provider to do it. But you're going to have to go out there and do that on your own. Of course, you're going to want to build a landing page promoting your podcast, because why else wouldn't you want to do that? And of course, you're going to want to spend some time marketing your podcast amongst all of the other things that you have to do in your life, which you don't have time to do, right? So the third problem is this. It's really time consuming. And I always ask people, how much time do you have? And most people say, I don't have that much time. We're busier than ever in our lives nowadays with our families, work, and everything that we do. So let's say you had a 40 episode podcast. You could probably expect to record your voice about 5 to 6 hours of reading time based upon, how many words you had in each chapter and in your book in total. But, a typical book, 27,000 short book, that's about 2 hours of reading time. If you're going to do twice that, if you have an 80,000 word book, you're probably looking at 5 to 6 hours of actually reading your book. And you may not want to do that. And you don't have the time to do that. You're going to have to spend a lot of time setting up your equipment, learning your software. You're going to have to spend a lot of hours editing the audio and hours figuring out your hosting and submitting to podcast directories. And the total to that, I didn't even put a number there, because the truth is you don't have the time. Let's be honest. Most of us don't have the time. It's a lot of work to produce these podcasts. I do it. I've got a system down in it, but I've been doing it for years and years and years. So the expense is there. The time, not having the time is there, and the complexity of it is there. And that's why most people don't start a podcast. But everything that I said, you're saying to yourself, Jim, I need to start one, because everything you said about the 1 in 4 people listening to them and 10 billion downloads and all these things and all of the things that come with the podcast, I need to figure out a way to do that. So fortunately, we have a solution for you to do that. So how do you do all this? How do you do it easier without a lot of time, without spending so much money? Well, I'm going to show you a system that I have today that allows you to create a podcast, and all you have to do is send us your manuscript. So before I do that, I just want to say that stick around to the end of this presentation, because I do have one screen left at the end where I'm going to show you how to make a podcast on the cheap. And if you just want to get started, do it on your own. You don't want to hire anyone. You want to just do it with the basic level equipment that you need. I'm going to show you how to do that at the end of this presentation. So stick around. Let me get through this demo of this new system that I have here that's going to solve your podcasting book problems here. And the solution to that is a new service called Book to Pod, which I created. And basically what we do is we turn your book into podcast episodes, into multi-layered, leveled podcast episodes. And it helps you find new customers and grow your brand, right? And here's the key. Here's the catch to the whole thing. You never have to record any audio or learn equipment or do anything, because here's why. We use the power of text to speech, which is the power of computerized voices, to produce your podcast for you. And I'm going to play you some samples here in a second here. But I just want you to understand, this is the future. And if you have a book now that you don't have the time or the money or the energy to produce into a podcast, and you want to reach all of those things, Book to Pod Book2Pod will do that for you without you having to do anything except actually uploading your manuscript. So let me show you. This is the Book2Pod site, and basically you could go through the site and look and see some of our examples, and we'll show some of those here. But I want to just show you how it works real quick. So basically, if you go to our How It Works page, you're going to see step one is this. You send us your book manuscript, and then you choose your podcast options. So basically, you place your order, you go in, you send us your manuscript, and then you fill out a form, simple form. It says, what voice do you want to use? And we'll talk about voices in a second. Then you choose what music do you want to use. You'll have different music choices you can choose from as sounders in and out of your podcast. You can even write a custom call to action that you can put into every podcast episode of every chapter, where you say, hey, visit my website at www.whatever to get a free copy of my latest book, or to sign me up for a free consultation. That's the first step. That's all you have to do, actually. Just send us your book manuscript and order, and we take care of the rest. The second step to this process is we're going to create your brand new podcast artwork. So if you go to iTunes, or if you go to any podcast directories, you'll look and you see these really great, attractive looking box podcast artwork. And boy, they're just fun to look at because they're really well done, the good ones. And we're going to create for you, for your book, a customized podcast artwork based upon your colors and your book cover and all those wonderful things. And we're going to produce that for you, and we're going to use that to publish your podcast to the Book2Pod network for you. You're not going to have to do that on your own, and you're going to get that as part of the whole service. And it will be designed in a way to get noticed. So what happens then is that our robots go into the lab. So we have robot voices, and basically what we do is we send them into the lab, and the one you picked, and we have them produce your book into episodes. We break your book into episodes like chapters. We add the sounders music that you've chosen. We add your custom call to action to each episode. We add any, all those things. We build each chapter together, and we produce those files for you using the power of robot voices. And it's all done very quickly, right? So instead of you spending, 5 days reading your book, and editing your voice and correcting errors and things like that, we're going to get this done for you in, a couple days or less. And we're using computers to do that. Now, we use a system called Amazon Poly, which is developed by Amazon, or the AWS platform, which is one of the biggest companies in the world. And Amazon Poly gives us the development platform to produce text-to-speech computer-generated voices based upon content. So it's widely developed, it's widely supported, and it's getting better every single month. And we predict that in a certain amount of time, you're not going to be able to really tell the difference between the voices. And I'll play you some samples. You can see what you think, but you can say it's not perfect yet, but it is pretty darn close. All right, so then step 4, what we do is we build you a beautiful Book2Pod landing page. Every Book2Pod customer is going to get a landing page that's designed for them, that's going to have a list of their book, their projects, all of their podcast episodes. People can play it. They can link back to their websites or their social media or whatever they want. It's all just built for you. And you're going to have this page delivered to you with a custom link. So you can take that link and you can promote it anywhere you want. You can put it on your blog, your social media, add it to your website, your email signature, wherever you want. So not only is your book getting submitted to those podcast directories, but we're giving you a custom landing page where you can have all of your podcast episodes in one place. All right. So the last step to this whole process is we create, host, and publish your podcast for you. So you say, all right, we're ready to go. And basically what we do is we submit your podcast on our behalf to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. Now, those are the 4 major players in the podcast directory space right now. And when you upload to those places, it gets distributed to lots of other networks. Now, there are plenty of other places you can upload to as well. It's kind of like the Amazon rule. Amazon's getting most of the traffic and most of the sales, but there are other places you can upload to. These are the 4 big ones. So we upload there, and it gets distributed to other places. We also host your podcast for you. So built into the cost of the Book2Pod is a year of podcast hosting, where we're going to actually host it. It's all going to be taken care of for you, okay? And we'll submit it to the directories for you. So again, you're getting your podcast artwork done. You're getting the hosting. You're getting the podcast chapters, the book transferred into chapters, written, read by digitally powered voices. You're getting submitted to all these directories. You're getting a landing page. You're getting all of this as part of the entire book to pod system. And basically all you have to do is order and send in your manuscript. And it's really that simple. And in a couple of days, you can have a brand new podcast out there. And look, you can even choose your schedule for how you'd like to publish it. If you have a 30-chapter book, you could tell us, we'd like each chapter published every week for the next 30 weeks. Think about that for a second. Think about having 30 pieces of content published over a 30-week period. You may tell us, look, just publish them all at once. We'd love to just have it out there because we want to get more leads and sales and people interested. We'll just push them all at once. Or you might say, let's publish them every single day. It's totally up to you. But that's all part of the book to pod system. And that's all you have to do. So if we go into the examples page, you can actually hear some examples of the podcast. And I'm going to play one of them for you just so you can kind of get an idea of what it sounds like. Now, also remember, when you publish with Book to Pod, we include you in the Book to Pod network of shows. So you're going to get included into all the people subscribed to the Book to Pod network as well. And you'll be added to those channels as well. So there's a little extra promotion that comes with all of this. So let me see. Here's my book, Go Direct. I can add more books under my account. There's a nonfiction book, Cinderella Dreams of Fire here. Let's play a sample from Buyer Legends by the Eisenberg brothers, Brian Eisenberg. And this book ended up being 9 episodes and 1 hour and 20 minutes. And let me go ahead and play this sample for you.
You're listening to the Book to Pod Network, where authors turn their books into powerful and attention-getting podcasts. The content will begin in a moment. Please remember to subscribe and leave a review. The author thanks you for listening. Now on with the show. Buyer Legends. The Executive Storyteller's Guide. How to use stories to reveal the opportunities and gaps in your customer's experience within your current marketing and sales process. By New York Times best-selling authors Brian and Jeffrey Eisenberg with Anthony Garcia. What are buyer legends? Buyer legends is a simple scenario narrative process that helps identify the gap between brand story and buyer experience.
All right, so I'm going to hit pause there so you can get an idea of that's what a sample episode / chapter sounds like from one of Brian's chapters from his book, Buyer Legends. And that was using our Nigel voice, which is a British male accent, okay? So if you want to get an example of what it sounds with like an American, you can go and look at nonfiction of Webinar Way, or let's try my book, which is Go Direct. Here we go.
You're listening to the Book to Pod Network, where authors turn their books into powerful and attention-getting podcasts. The content will begin in a moment. Please remember to subscribe and leave a review. The author thanks you for listening. Now on with the show. Hi, I'm Harry, your Book to Pod computer narrator host for this podcast. Being that I am not human, I hope you understand that sometimes I will pronounce words and phrases incorrectly. Please don't hold this against the podcast author. They're only human, and humans aren't perfect. See what I did there? I can tell jokes too. Okay, enough from me. Let's get this party started. Go Direct. The Content Creator's Guide to Eliminating the Middlemen and Avoiding the Gatekeepers. By Jim F. Kukral. Copyright 2014. Visit GoDirectBook.com for more information. Dear reader, if you are a
Okay, so as you can see, that was an example of the first chapter episode of my book Go Direct, and it played a sounder, which I chose. Then I chose the voice, which was Harry, the American male, and then it had the custom call to action in there. And as you can see, that's how each episode would sound, right? And that book ended up, I think, being about 30,000 words, and the actual audio total of that book is just under 2 hours of podcast episode time out of 11 episodes. Now, if you look at the Buyer's Legend book, that was only 9 episodes because it's a shorter book. And that was an hour and 20 minutes of time of audio. But if you look at this Cinderella Dreams of Fire book, that book was big enough that it was 40 episodes, and the audio listening time was 5 hours and 13 minutes. Okay. Now, for fun, we put some examples up there. We took Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a royalty-free book, and we turned that into a podcast, and it ended up being 28 episodes, and it's almost 9 hours of content just reading that book that's available for anyone to read online for free at any time. And we took that and we turned that into a podcast as well, which is really cool, which, by the way, is getting listened to on the Book to Pod network every single day, which is amazing because people are now listening to the book via the podcast episodes, and it just kind of blows my mind. So there are some examples in there for you to check out as well. Joanna Penn did say, if you don't know who Joanna Penn is, she's one of the big time self-publishing authors that exist out in the space today, and she mentioned us on her podcast recently. And she said she thinks this is going to be the future of audio content, given that audio is the fastest growing segment of publishing. So, people like Joanna Penn believe in what we're doing here at Book to Pod. And as the technology gets better and better, we also believe that it's going to do some amazing things. So if you want to know what's going on with Book to Pod, you can go on over to our voices page. You can listen to our samples of our voice actors that we have. Amazon Polly gives us a bunch of voices you can use, but we have chosen the 4 best ones we think work the best. You can read our FAQ page. We've got all kinds of your questions answered here on this page for everything that you would need to know about everything that you're doing in terms of producing a Book to Pod. And of course, you can go in at any time and learn about the pricing. Basically, we have pricing as it exists right now. It could change any day, but right now we do have our pricing at that. Now, you can also do a test drive. So this is really interesting. So what if you want to understand maybe what it's going to sound like for your book? Just go to our test drive page and click, put your book title in, your name, put in a short, character thing of your book here, choose your voice that you want to use, tell us what the book's about, and just hit enter. And basically what happens is we'll create an audio file for you so you can actually hear what it sounds like. Okay? So check that out at booktopod.com as well. So, all right. So before we wrap up and get to the end of this presentation here, here's an example of some of the landing pages that we produce for our Book to Pod authors. This is one for Casey Lane Books, and as you can see, it's a really nice looking landing page designed just for her books. It's got a link back to her website, and you could go in and play episodes of the book through here. You can send this to anyone you want. You can see every episode here. Here's another one for Buyer Legends. And the other book that we did, same type of thing. You could send this landing page to people. They can get to their Twitter, their Facebook, their other website, their channel. So it's another promotional effort for you to have more people read your content. Now, you can also take your digital files and just download them and put them on your own website if you want to. It's totally up to you. We're going to produce the files for you and distribute them if you want. But most people will want to get that exposure, which is the entire point of having a book as a podcast. So let me go back to the presentation here because I do want to give you what I told you I said I would give you, which was that that free information about how to create a podcast on the cheap. But before I do that, we basically have an offer. If you're interested in signing up for Book to Pod today, if you're watching this, just go to booktopod.com. And if you use the code ROBOT during your checkout, just validate the coupon code or the gift certificate during checkout, and we're offering 20% off of your order when you create your new Book to Pod. And we'd love to have you on board soon because I'd love for you to get part of the podcasting explosion. So let me talk about the quick and cheap podcasting things you can do to just get started, because a lot of you are going to be like, well, I don't want to do that yet, Jim, or I don't want to spend $3,000. I don't want to spend any money. I just want to do it on the cheap. Well, there are some ways you can start podcasting really cheap. You need to get a mic, and I'm using a $450 mic, and I've got a really good sound from it, but you can get other mics. Like, for example, there's a mic called the Blue Yeti mic you can buy on Amazon. I think it's for under $100 now, and it will do the job. It's not going to give you the sound you're getting from this, but it will give you a good enough sound to produce your own podcast. There are other mics you can use as well, but I recommend that one. Audacity is a free piece of software you can download where you can do your recording of your podcast and editing of your podcast. So download Audacity, plug your mic in, hit record, and you can record right into the computer using this program. It's a really great way to easily and quickly record your own podcast as well. And then you can export right to a file where you can upload to your podcast hosting provider. And you can also edit in it. So if you want to add some music in there or whatever else you want to add in there, you can edit. It's not that difficult. It takes a little bit of a learning curve, but you can absolutely do it, and it's free. Pond 5 is a great site, speaking of music, that you can get cheaper, royalty-free music clips, like sound clips like you heard in the Book to Pod examples. If you want to get a little sounder or a music to use at the beginning of your podcast, you can go and listen to, 100,000 different little samples of music, classical, jazz, you name it, kitsch, whatever you want, and download a sound clip that you can use in your podcast. Well, of course, royalty-free if you pay for it. Here's a little tip that I'll give you. If you find a local musician, you can usually get them to edit or produce your podcast for free. Now, younger people who are in bands, even people who are older who are in bands, they know how to edit music. And they know how to use audio editing files. So find a musician. You may know one in your family or have a friend or something, and they may say, look, I'll produce your podcast for you. Just send me the files. I'll mix it up. They might do it for free. You might find somebody on Craigslist who does that, but look to musicians, because you can always find a musician who's really good at those types of things. Fiverr.com is a great site if you just want to try and do stuff on the cheap, like finding an editor or maybe somebody to design your podcast artwork for you for $5 or $10. That's what the whole site's based on, getting something done for really cheap cost. You get what you pay for there sometimes. You may get something really great, or you may get something that's just kind of like, wow, I could have done that at home on my own computer for $5. However, sometimes you find a diamond in the rough there, and for $5, you can't go wrong. So check out Fiverr for some of those things. Now, the last piece of advice I want to give you is to be consistent with your schedule. If you're going to start a podcast and you're going to want to produce it every week or every day or however you decide you want to do it, you want to be consistent. You got to stick with it. If you're going to, this podcaster, people who subscribe to podcasts want to get the subscription, right? So some people like to binge, right? Netflix people, I love to binge shows. I don't want to have to wait till next week to watch a show, right? We're moving to that economy of society where people just want to get it when they can get it. So you can just upload everything at once. But there are people in the podcasting world who love to get it every week or every other day or however you want. Just stay consistent with your schedule with whatever you do. In terms of podcast hosting, Simplecast.fm is one of my favorites. I believe it's $12 a month. And basically what they do is they take your audio files and they host them, and you can then take that feed they give you and submit that to the podcast directories. And that's one of the simplest, easiest ones that exist out there, and the cheapest ones. There are plenty of other ones you could find, but that's what I recommend. And finally, don't worry about scripts and mistakes, okay? Have fun with your podcast. This is not meant to be, this perfect, recording with no ums and ahs and breaks and stutters. Just talk, right? Don't try to make this into this perfect thing. Podcasting, that's not what it's about. It's about having a conversation. It's about having content out there that people want to consume to either have a problem solved or to be entertained by. So don't turn this into a thing where you're going to stress over reading your chapter of your book. If you're reading and you mess up a word, just keep going. If you say something wrong, or if you didn't say it with the right inflection, yeah, you could re-record it. But honestly, do you really need to do that? Just have fun with podcasting. Put it out there. Talk to people. Read your book. Just make it something that you're not stressed out about, because the people listening don't want to be stressed out as well. They want to feel like they're just sitting in a room having a conversation with you or on the phone with you. Okay. So that's my advice for doing some quick, cheap editing of podcasts. Now, the last thing I'll tell you is, if you haven't used Skype, Skype is a great way to do podcast recording, because you can call each other through the internet for free, which I use for the Sell More Book Show. We call each other, and then we just record it using a piece of software called Ecamm, ECAMM software. And basically, it's a very inexpensive piece of software. And basically, what that does is it allows you to record your Skype calls, and then you can edit the sound and stuff in later. So there are really cheap and inexpensive ways to start a podcast, and you can do that for your book. But of course, if you just want to get it done and you want it to be done in a really cool way that people are like kind of like wow about, you should check out Book to Pod. We have a 20% coupon for anyone who's watching this. Just go to booktopod.com, put in the code ROBOT when you check out, and in a couple days, you're going to have a really cool podcast ready to go to find new potential readers, listeners, and customers for you, just like that. All you got to do is send us your manuscript. And for a lot of you people out there who don't have a lot of time and energy to do things, this is a great option for you. And we'd love to produce your Book to Pod for you. And thank you very much for everybody for listening. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about this today. If you don't use us at Book to Pod, I highly suggest that you do it on your own. The podcasting universe at this point in time is like the wild, wild west. And it's going to get easier when the technology gets easier, but it's going to get harder like Amazon, because then the competition gets so big. If you are writing a book in a certain genre, you want to have your podcast out before your competing author does. I'm telling you right now, we're at that stage in the game where you want to have this done before the competitors get on board. And that's what a service like Book to Pod will do for you. Or you could just do that on your own, but you got to do it. Such bad grammar. You got to do it. You have to do it. You have to produce a podcast, because right now is the time, because there's just so many opportunities available in the podcasting world. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Go to booktopod.com. Check out our samples. You can also go to Book to Pod and submit a test drive. And when you're ready, go ahead and use the coupon code ROBOT to check out and get 20% off of your order. Look forward to having our robot voices get to work on your story today, and looking forward to driving more sales and leads and customers and readers and listeners and all of those wonderful things to your business or your brand or your books. I'm Jim Kukrow from authormarketingclub.com and Author Marketing Institute, and of course, Book to Pod. Have a great book selling week and month and business and year wherever you are in the world, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.